old Warhammer was beautiful. Believe it or not, there was a time when Games Workshop had a soul. There was an age of beautiful artwork, flavorful rules, paint guides, and DIY terrain steps in your own codex. Full pages of lore with full art pictures for every character and more. There was a time without monthly FAQs, without mass competitive play and math hammer craze. A time where models weren't discontinued and made unplayable every time you got a new codex. From epic 1v1 challenges to fighting in the dead of night to watching your psyker explode after rolling at Perils of the Warp. Before 8th edition came around, Warhammer used to be a lot different. 8th edition was an attempt to streamline the rules to appeal to both new players and competitive players, as many of these competitive players cared little for concepts such as flavor, lore accurate, and fun, only for balance. For a time, Warhammer was reduced to a quarter of the rules and became a fairly simple numbers game, which both attracted new players and drove away veteran players. This is not a video to harp on people who enjoyed 8th edition or any of the new stuff. Truth be told, the dark days began in 7th edition with the addition of formations and supplements. This brought rules bloat in a new way for hyper-competitive players to ruin the game for everyone else. Things like D-weapons were understandably frustrating as well. I see the appeal to New Age 40k and understand why people like it. It is much more suitable for competitive play, except it's not really, and it is new player friendly, except it's not really. Jokes aside, on paper it is both of these things until you look at the win rates and 20 stratagems per army, but 10th edition seems to be handling this fairly well. Honestly, I actually enjoyed 9th edition and thought it was a big step back in the right direction. The stratagems were the worst thing about it for new players, but the armies were still understandable and had a fair bit of flavor rules. 10th edition seemed okay with the reduction of stratagems, although I must confess I played some games with my Eldar, Necrons, and Chaos Space Marines, and it all just felt incredibly bland. It was just pointing and clicking for me, but with some extra steps of moving models and rolling dice. I've never really felt this way in 40k since 8th edition, and never did I feel that way before 8th edition. I told myself this may change when my armies get codexes, and yes, they now have more rules, but the new Necrons codex was actually what prompted me to make this video. The simple news that Anarchir the Traveler, Vargard Oberon, and Nemesis Zandrek were no longer in my codex. How could this happen? Quite literally, my 3 favorite Necron characters were no longer tournament legal and were shoved into Legends. This was honestly quite heartbreaking, and really just showed me how far GW has gone. From the days of having rules for characters that didn't even have a model, to completely removing fan favorites from the book altogether. It shows me how the game is leaving a narrative direction and steering much more towards the competitive side. So I decided to make this video. I would love for you to visit the past with me for a time while I make a case for old edition Warhammer 40k. I want to first look at the codexes. I started 40k in 5th edition when Tau were still playing with a 3rd edition codex. I believe 5th edition has some of the most beautiful and passionate codex cover artwork, and this was definitely lost in the transition to 6th. Thankfully though, the inside art did not suffer so much and in fact improved. The profile and general art went from black and white, which has its own gritty aesthetic that perfectly fits 40k, to absolutely gorgeous full art pictures. Along with a full picture, you got a whole page of lore for each unit and character in your book. This changed in 7th edition and onwards, when they replaced the pictures with just the model, and now you get even less in the new books. You're lucky to get more than 2 sentences of lore for your units now. Let's continue to look at these codexes before we get into stats though. Look at these absolutely stunning artworks, both grimdark and pretty to look at. In a lot of older codexes, there are sections with how to start collecting, how to paint your armory, and even here in the old Necrons codex, there's a DIY terrain guide. Take a look at these fun Space Wolf scenes they set up and captioned. Overall, it's a beautiful and extremely passionate look. You're already establishing a rich flavor and narrative feel for your army without reading a single rule. Now that we've taken a quick look at the feel of our codex, let's dive into the rules, starting with our stat line. Let's look at this regular old tactical marine squad. You'll see there is no movement statistic because all infantry moves 6 inches, while units like jump pack infantry, bikes, and the likes move 12. Other units have more means of movement, which we can get into later. The first stat we have is weapon skill, and you'll notice it is not a simple dice roll number. Weapon skill represents how skilled one is in close combat. These marines have a weapon skill of 4, which is higher than the average 3 used for basic humans. When you fight in close combat, you compare weapon skills, and this determines what you need to roll to hit each other. A unit with high weapon skill attacking someone with low weapon skill hits them easier, and the opposite is true when you reverse it. This simulates the actual duels happening, as the more skilled blade masters parry and maneuver around their opponents, while the less skilled combatants have a harder time keeping up and landing blows with their enemy. It's simpler than it sounds. Simply put, if your weapon skill is higher than the enemy, you hit on a 3+, and if yours is lower, you hit on a 4+. Now, if your weapon skill is 2 times less than your opponent's, you hit on 5s instead. You never hit on 2s or 6s. It's a pretty simple rule, and it was sad to go, as now there is no difference between a legendary duelist and a Space Marine captain. Whoever goes first is probably going to kill the other person in 1 turn. Next we have ballistic skill. This represents how skilled the unit is with a ranged weapon. Again, it is an actual number instead of a dice value. The chart is easy for this, especially as most things have either ballistic skill 3 or 4. It's quite straightforward. Ballistic skill 1 means you hit on 6s, 2 means 5s, 3 means 4s, and so on until we reach 6. For every number over 5 you get a reroll, and this reroll starts at the bottom of the chart. Generally, only characters will have a higher than ballistic skill 5. A ballistic skill of 6 means you hit on a 2+, and if you miss, you get a reroll, but this reroll will only hit on a 6+. The same goes up to 10, where you have a reroll that hits on a 2+. This sets apart the galaxy's skilled snipers and arms masters, instead of everyone just hitting on a 2+. It's also really fun to look at a unit and see the number 10 on their stats. It makes them feel very special and awesome in their aspect of war. Next is strength. Strength and toughness are relatively similar to what they are now, with a few exceptions. In the days of old, you would wound something on 6s if its toughness was 2 or higher than your strength. If its toughness was more than double your strength, you could not wound it as your weapons are useless. If a weapon's strength was double your toughness, it would instantly kill you if you failed your save. This makes sense, as a railgun shot to the face of a captain would reduce said captain to thin air. A little bit frustrating, yes, but hey, now your giant Tyranid monster isn't taking wounds from las guns that barely scratch a Space Marine's flesh in the lore. If you got into combat with something you could not wound, you could declare our weapons are useless and fall out of combat on your turn. Moving on to one of my favorite stats alongside weapon skill, we have initiative. I think losing initiative was a massive blow to the game. You see, simply charging did not give you the first attack, and you did not just alternate units when fighting. Charging did, however, give each model in your unit an extra attack. Your initiative determined when you struck. Whoever had the highest initiative would fight first. Naturally, Eldar were faster than humans, humans were faster than Necrons, and so on, which makes perfect sense. The faster things were generally not as hard hitting, with the slower units being usually both tough and strong, with Space Marines, as always, being somewhere in the middle. Unwieldy weapons like Power Fists and Thunder Hammers would fight at initiative 1, with the existence of weapon skill as well as 3 attacks per guy being an insane amount of attacks back then. You usually got the chance to fight back with whatever unit was fighting, unless it was incredibly in favor for the opponent, such as, let's say, a Howling Banshee squad fighting a 6-man unit of poor, terrified fire warriors. That moves us to leadership, something that has drastically changed. Leadership represents how brave and or disciplined your unit is. When you rolled a leadership test, you would roll 2 dice and try to roll under your unit's leadership. Usually you would be taking this test if your unit lost more than 25% of its starting strength. If they failed a leadership test, they would begin to run away, and you would move your unit towards your table edge to show them losing morale and fleeing. They would get a chance next turn to attempt to rally. This brings me to a less fun mechanic, but one that made melee viable: sweeping advance. If you lost a combat, you would need to roll a leadership test and subtract the amount of soldiers you lost. If failed, you rolled off with your opponent and added your initiatives. If your opponent won the roll-off, you would remove your unit from play as the enemy runs you down. Flavorfully, it makes sense, as you turn and flee, allowing the faster enemy to cut you down. This sounds brutal, and to be honest, it sometimes was, but it would generally only happen if you had lower leadership units fighting big scary melee units such as, I'm using Eldar as an example again, a unit of guardsmen fighting striking scorpions. While you might be worried for your slow initiative 2 Necrons, they have a leadership of 10 and are tough as nails, so they likely won't be getting ran down too often. Fighting something like Necrons who all have initiative 2 gave you a much higher chance of getting away and fleeing. Finally, we have the save. This is the same as it is nowadays, but AP functions differently and was actually easier in the old editions. Simply put, if the armor piercing value of the enemy's weapon was equal to or lower than your armor save, you did not get your armor save. You would need to use a cover save or your invulnerable save. Let's take a look at Mr. Marine. He has a weapon skill of 4, allowing him to hit most mortal beings on a 3+, a ballistic skill of 4, allowing him to shoot on a 3+, a strength and toughness of 4, making him good and beefy, 1 wound as almost everything had back then, an initiative of 4, giving him the edge over your average line trooper, a leadership of 8, and the ability to auto-rally when falling back, as they shall know no fear, and the save of 3+ conferred from their power armor. Most small arms fire was AP4 or higher, so this means the Marines will be getting their armor save quite often. This might sound fairly overwhelming, but trust me, like any game, the base mechanics are very easy to learn and eventually remember. I have actually been writing this script at the gym and have all these rules from memory despite it being something like 5 years since I used them. Is this because I'm an autist whose brain is the repository of game rules? Maybe. Is it also because these concepts aren't as complicated as they sound? Also yes, I hope. Next I want to look at war gear customization. In the old days, you weren't punished for converting your models. If the war gear you wanted was in the book but not sold by GW, you could slap a jetpack on your Chaos Lord or throw him on a bike. Along with this, the customization options were crazy, especially for things such as command squads and Tau battlesuits. You could have two of the same units and have them perform completely different battlefield roles. You could really get into the characterization of your Chaos Chosen or your Terminators, as the options and kits you could give them were limitless. It was a lot to keep track of certainly, and if you didn't want to deal with all that, kitting out your unit with all the same weapons was completely viable as well. You are paying the points for all the upgrades, so without them you just get more points for more guys. You could also take any number of models in your squad, as long as it was between the minimum and maximum numbers. Captains, chapter masters, autarchs, hive tyrants, chaos lords, and the likes had a plethora of options, from simple bolt pistol and chainsword to a jump pack thunderhammer meltagun and a relic. It gave so much flavor and fun to your characters, and you didn't need to take a named character to make your own unique one on the tabletop. Along with this customization, take a look at all the successor chapters you could play as. These all have their own unique chapter tactics and a special character, and these aren't just different ways to reroll ones and gain extra dice for things. I'm talking about actual cool lore related special rules. For example, let's take a look at the Mantis Warriors, a Marauder's successor with White Scar's lineage, who are masters of ambush and reading the battlefield. These fellas get to reroll seizing the initiative, can take divination psychic powers, are unaffected by difficult terrain, and gain bonuses such as Furious Charge for charging out of cover as they spring their traps. This encourages you to play your army in a very unique and fun way. Simply bringing a gun line or melee or vehicle spam won't give you anything with your rules. For this chapter, you'll want to bring fast and maneuverable units who can set up in cover then ambush your foes. This brings me to special rules. We are seeing a return of universal special rules, but it is still not quite the same. There were a good 2+ pages in the rulebook showing you the universal special rules, probably like 4 or 5 actually. Having this information allowed the game to give units multiple rules to make them unique, and at the same time allowed you to simply remember what rules go along with the one on their profile. Rules like Stealth and Shrouded were in this category, along with rules like Hammer of Wrath, which represented the unit ramming into the enemy as they crash into combat atop bikes or jetpacks, doing a strength 4 hit to anything in base contact with them, or Furious Charge, which gave you an extra strength when charging. Some more special rules along with Wargear rules were Rend, giving you AP 1 on the roll of a 6 to wound, Outflank, giving you the ability to come from reserves onto the enemy's deployment zone depending on the turn, Instant Death, which would represent a weapon that simply obliterated what it shot at, or perhaps more subtly, injected a lethal poison into its opponents, and the counterpart Eternal Warrior, representing a hero blessed by incredible toughness or perhaps fate itself, allowing them to shake off the most defeating wounds. Having Eternal Warrior meant you would not die from instant death weapons, or weapons twice your toughness, and you would only take a wound. One of my favorite special rules was the Jetpack rule. This allowed a unit to move 2d6 inches during the assault phase, allowing you to move, shoot, and move again, giving you some awesome hit and run capabilities. Most units who had this ability only moved 6 inches normally, so it wasn't like they were moving 24 inches a turn or anything. It was tons of fun. A very dividing rule was Blast. Blast used to use templates, either the small or large templates, or the giant ones once you got into the Forge World stuff. And when firing, you would roll 2d6 and a scatter die. You would take the 2d6 and subtract your ballistic skill, then scatter the blast template that many inches in the direction the scatter dice pointed, measuring from the center of the template. This represents a miscalculation of the shot, or perhaps simply strong winds. You could also roll a direct hit, and the template would remain on the heads of your enemies. Next, all enemies under the template would be rolled to wound, and so on and so forth. Flamer weapons also used their own special templates that you would place on the edge of the firer's base and do wounds to everyone under said template. Naturally, this would lead to arguments at times, but as long as you and your opponent were decent people, agreements could be easily made. If completely necessary, you could call in a third party to check. Speaking of shooting, let's talk about line of sight. In 6th edition and the likes, line of sight made about as logical sense as you would think it does. To check line of sight, you would look from your model's head, and if they could see the enemy, they could shoot. Now this means only models that can see can shoot, and the same thing went for casualties, allowing you to kill only enemies you could see and were within range of. If you did 10 wounds to a unit but could only see 2 models, then naturally, you still only could kill 2 models, as you do not have magic bullets that can fly around buildings. Along with this, the closest enemy models were removed, so you could not place all your special war gear and heavy weapons in the front, unless you wanted them to get blasted first. Again, it only makes sense. Most importantly, the rules for vehicles vehicles made complete sense. For a vehicle's line of sight, you would look from their weapons. Sponsons could only shoot what they could see in their arc of vision. This meant you couldn't just stick 1mm of your Predator out from behind a solid wall and shoot all 4 of its las cannons. You would need to have it looking straight at an enemy. You also couldn't shoot all your rear weapons at an enemy right in front of you, as your tank does magical 360s. All logical, right? Speaking of vehicles, one of my favorite rules is armor value. Each vehicle had a front, side, and rear armor value, as most vehicles have strong armor in the fronts and sides but weak armor in the back. This rewarded you for flanking the enemy and throwing melt bombs into the back of their wave serpent, or bringing your rockets down on the side of a Leman Russ battle tank. It also made it so that small arms fire could not harm heavily armored vehicles. Your Imperial Knights could no longer be charged and killed by a swarm of guardsmen. The guardsmen could, however, bring their special weapons to bear because perhaps your enemy outfitted a unit to specifically hunt tanks and the likes. These rules also encouraged you to bring different types of squads for both anti-infantry and anti-armor. When firing at a vehicle, you would first look at their armor value. If the strength of your weapon plus any d6 roll could meet or beat the armor, you could damage the enemy. The lowest armor value was 10 and the highest was 14. An armor value of 10 meant that a strength 4 bolter could damage it, as it is lightly armored and mass bolter fire could dent it up, enough to bring it down. If your strength plus d6 roll matched the enemy's armor, you would score a glancing hit, which would remove a hull point, which were essentially wounds for vehicles. Most vehicles had 2 to 3 hull points. The extra fun part happened when you beat the enemy's armor. Then you would score a penetrating hit and roll on the vehicle damage table, adding modifiers depending on the AP of your weapon and the type of vehicle. For example, you would add 1 to the result if you fired an AP2 weapon, and another 1 if the vehicle was open-topped, as it has less armor protecting the insides. This table went from 1 to 7, with 1 to 3 being a simple crew shaken, making it harder for the vehicle to shoot next turn, to a 5, which would blow off one of its weapons, to a 6, which resulted in your vehicle being immobilized, as the enemy has shot your treads or damaged your hover technology. A 7 meant it exploded. People inside and out would take damage from the shrapnel. Then you would leave a crater in place of the vehicle. If a vehicle was reduced to 0 hull points, it would become a wreck and simply become a mobile cover, as the vehicle would not just disappear into thin air. The armor facing system was tons of fun, and really made you consider placement of your vehicles and your vehicle hunting units. Speaking of tables, take a look at this one. This is the Chaos Boons table. Whenever your character killed another character, and remember sergeants and squad leaders had the character special rule at this point, they got to roll on the Chaos Boon table. Now you can see there's tons of buffs you can get from okay to pretty good, but the extra fun part is the 11 and 66. On an 11, your offering is deemed unworthy and has offended your god so poorly that they turn you into a chaos spot. On a 66, your offering is so glorious that the god has given you apotheosis and you ascend into a demon prince. You didn't have crazy stuff happening every game, but this table was just so much fun and really made it feel like your character was trying to gain glory in the eyes of the chaos gods. You could watch your kitted out chaos lord or Huron Blackheart turn into a spawn in a hilarious display, or you could see your Chaos Space Marine Sergeant explode into a Demon Prince. Absolutely incredible times. Perhaps I should transition into one of the things I miss the most, cover. In these days, not every board was the exact same, with 4 quarters of line of sight blocking terrain that, even though it has windows you can't see through, cover was much different. Each type of cover gave you a specific save, and as long as you could see the enemy, you could shoot them. Makes sense, right? For example, trees and forests gave you a 5+ cover save, and ruins gave you a 4+. This works the same as invulnerable saves, where if the enemy's weapon's AP was too powerful for your armor save, you could take the cover save instead, as the tree stops a las bolt or the metal barricade halts a shuriken cannon shot. Some weapons of course had ignores cover, such as flamers, as they wash the area in fire, allowing for nowhere to hide. Units like Rangers, Lictors, and Scouts had the Stealth special rule, giving them a +1 cover save, or some had Shrouded, which gave a +2, as either the unit are masters of utilizing cover, or perhaps are covered by a strange alien gas. Some terrain was also harder to move through, and certain vehicles risk getting stuck if you send them through rough terrain. Difficult terrain would simply slow your troops down unless they had the move through cover special rule. You would roll 2d6 and choose the highest for your move. If you moved a vehicle through this terrain though and roll a 1, it became immobilized. Dangerous terrain was even scarier. Each model would roll if moving through perhaps an area riddled with lava or falling rocks. Certain fast units like jetpacks treated difficult terrain as dangerous if they started or ended their move within it. On the roll every 1, something terrible happened and a model would die. You would roll a dice for each model. Moving on to missions. The missions are something I dearly miss. The objective missions were all fairly similar, but then we have crazy ones like the Relic. With the Relic, there was a single objective and your infantry units could pick it up. The mission revolved solely around fighting over the Relic and trying to take it from the other player or defend it the best you could. Naturally, there were movement limits, so you couldn't simply send in your jump packs and run away with it. And if memory serves me correctly, you would drop it if you ran or entered close combat. It was a crazy mission, and me and my buddies still play it today even though it no longer exists. Other missions were generally objective missions, with a unit type counting towards extra victory points if you destroyed units of that type, such as Big Guns Never Tire, where you'd score points for each heavy support you destroyed. Objectives were placed by the players and you generally used D3 plus 2 objectives, making each game a little different and forced you to play in different ways. You would also roll every time to see your deployment for the generic missions, but not the Maelstrom ones. Secondaries were basic but still fun. You got points for First Blood, slaying the Warlord, and having units behind enemy lines. The game would go to turn 5, but then had a chance to go to turn 6 on a dice roll of a 3+. Sometimes on a roll of a 4+, you would go to turn 7 for an absolute slog. Another fun and sometimes either frustrating or elating mechanic was seizing the initiative. After both armies were deployed before the game began, the player going second would roll a d6, and on a 6 they would seize the initiative either through newly gained battlefield intelligence, a wily plan of ambush, or sheer force of will. They would momentarily gain the upper hand over the enemy and go first. It didn't come up often, but when it did, it was exciting and crazy for both players. It also gave you some incentive to not put your whole army on the deployment line, and be a little bit more cautious with where you start. Possibly one of the coolest mechanics was night fighting. Some missions had you roll for it, or just started you in it. Usually it would happen for the first turn on a 4+, if you or your opponents wanted to roll for it. Your troops would be battling in the dead of night, making it impossible to shoot the enemy from a certain distance. Enemies within 12 inches could be shot at normally, enemies within 12 to 24 gained the stealth special rule, giving them a +1 cover save, and enemies between 24 and 36 gained shrouded, giving them a +2 to their cover save. If memory serves me correctly, you could not shoot something outside of 36 inches. Generally, night fighting would only last for the first turn, but sometimes it could go longer. Armies like the Necrons had ways to start the battle in darkness. In 7th edition, night fighting changed to only giving stealth. A giant nerf to shooting armies, you may say, and while it was tough at times, it gave melee armies a chance, for even then melee armies still struggled a little bit. You could also ignore night fighting with some of your units if they had night fight. This ability could be from keen animal eyes or mechanical supremacy, and either way it allowed you to ignore night fighting. An example would be Tau battlesuits who had black sun filters allowing them to see in the darkest areas. On the note of mechanics, I want to briefly mention perhaps the most epic rule in the game, challenges. If there were two units fighting that both contained a character, you could bellow a challenge to your opponent. They had two options: face you like a warrior or cower behind their troops. If they chose to accept the challenge, the two characters would move to the center of the combat and could only fight each other. They could not attack the other models in the unit, and the other models couldn't attack them, as the enemy troops respected the duel between their two commanders. If the opponent declined the challenge, the character would not make attacks this combat, as he shamefully hid behind his troops or stoically declined, knowing his life as a commander is worth more than the pride of fighting a duel. Anyways, GW also came out with the awesome Maelstrom cards, which are somewhat similar to what we have today, but gave us an extra 6 missions, all with different mechanics. I'll move to my final showcase, and perhaps the greatest, Psychic Powers. There was indeed a psychic phase, and the powers were all very different from each other, not just multiple ways to do mortal wounds. Mortal wounds didn't even exist back then. In the rulebook, there were 6 disciplines of psychic powers, and you could roll your powers on these tables depending on what faction your psyker was from. You also had your special faction-specific discipline. The generic ones are as follows. Biomancy, a discipline focusing on the sculpting and manipulation of flesh to either help or harm. It brought you powers like Iron Arm to buff your psyker with a staggering +3 strength and toughness. Warp Speed, which gave your psyker +3 initiative and attacks, as well as the Fleet rule, which allowed you to reroll movement rolls such as running. And then powers like Life Leech that sucked the life out of an enemy and restored wounds to the psyker or a friendly model. Divination was a discipline of prediction and the manipulation of fate. It focused mostly on buffs or debuffs, such as giving your unit an invulnerable save through Forewarning, or allowing your unit to fire Overwatch at full ballistic skill through Foreboding. Demonology was mainly the Grey Knights type of psychic powers. They had crazy spells like Vortex of Doom that caused your psyker to suffer perils of the warp if he had simply failed casting it. The Vortex, however, was a crazy blast template that destroyed everything under it. The more evil themed side of these powers is what started breaking the game, because it involved summoning demons. It was a new addition in 7th edition, so we can skip that. Pyromancy focused mainly on big hitting damage spells to reduce your enemies to ashes with spells like Molten Beam that drew a 12-inch beam and hit everything under it with a blazing force of energy, or Fire Shield that provided a 4+ cover save and made all terrain around your unit count as dangerous. Telekinesis used the powers and mastery of the mind, with powers such as levitation that allowed the Psyker and his unit to jump 12 inches, or Crush, which had the potential to do a massive blow to a target. Lastly, we have Telepathy, a discipline focused on mind controlling enemies and psychically linking to allies. Powers such as Hallucination, which let you roll in a table of 3 hallucinations, and depending on your dice you could get the following: Bugs, I hate bugs, causing the unit to make a pinning test. It's so beautiful, giving that unit a -1 to all stats other than wounds and saves. And finally, you are the traitor, which would cause strength 3 hits to a character in the unit for every other friendly model in that unit. Another telepathy power is invisibility, that made it so you could only hit a specific unit on the roll of a 6. Even more fun was Perils of the Warp. If your Psyker suffer the Perils of the Warp, you would roll on a table. On the roll of a 1, the Psyker must make a leadership test, and if failed, they are dragged into the warp, bringing those around with them. The Psyker is slain, and the models in their unit take d6 strength 6 AP 1 hits. On the roll of a 6, your Psyker is surged with warp energy, and after passing a leadership check, they are buffed up immensely. Everything between 2 to 5 were other various negatives, from losing a wound to losing a psychic power. So why did the game change so drastically? The biggest answer to that is found in 7th edition. 7th edition started off fine, but towards the tail end things started to get ridiculous. GW had started to make formations and supplement books. Formations were detachments with set parameters on what units you could take, and they would add special rules to your army. Some were useless, some were extremely overpowered. This was not all though. All of a sudden, to play your army you needed a campaign book with a few rules, a supplement codex with a few rules, and then your main codex and sometimes more. You could be playing with 3 or more books on hand just for one army, and this was pretty abysmal, I'll be honest. It also forced you to buy these books, especially because they kept coming out with more and more and more. This rules bloat was what drove the nail in the coffin, and GW decided to just blow it all up and seemingly start from scratch. Did they completely overshoot it and destroy half of what they had made alongside all the bad stuff that was easily removable? Of course they did. Thankfully, they started to bring back good stuff in 9th edition, and there has been some give and take in 10th. Honestly, I'm just glad characters can join units again. Overall, I love Warhammer. I still love the setting, I read the books, and I still play. With the Necron reveal, seeing that my 3 favorite characters, Xandrek, Oberyn, and Anrakir, who by the way could take control of enemy vehicles and shoot with their weapons in the old edition, as his lore suggests, were no longer in the book, along with my attitude towards the game, prompted me to make this video. I know this video was kind of all over the place, and honestly it was just me writing about all the stuff that I remember that I really loved about the game. Whenever something came into mind, I would write it down. Honestly, I could talk about this for hours, but I wanted to make sure I got this video done and didn't want to try and be perfect, adding every single thing about the game. Also, I forgot to mention flyers. They were actually usable back in the day, as ground units could only hit them on 6s, but that's besides the point. I've played maybe 10 games of 10th edition so far, winning around 7 to 8 of them, and every game has just felt so bland and boring to me. It just feels like a game of who can hide their units the best, then roll the most dice. The only good part about it is getting to spend time with friends, but that has nothing to do with the actual game. After playing Middle-earth, strategy battles, and Star Wars Legion, my enjoyment of New Age Warhammer has just declined more and more. I feel far more engaged and thoughtful in a game of Middle-earth, even though it has a quarter of the rules. The movement and flow of the game just forces you to think so much more in-depth and tactically than simply hiding, target priority, and standing on the right objective. Obviously, higher levels of 40k take a lot of skill. I'm not saying it doesn't require tactical acumen. I'm also not saying 40k now is bad. It just isn't for me. It doesn't spark feelings or emotions of an epic conflict with heroes battling it out and troops desperately fighting for their lives. Warhammer was a lot more about the narrative, and now it's more just about being a balanced game that can function as good as possible on the competitive level. It just feels like rolling dice and pointing at things. Obviously, that's just my opinion. I really do understand why people enjoy the new editions. Things are more about math, and in a way, the game is more easy to predict and optimize. As someone who just enjoys having fun, making a narrative, and winning with wacky stuff, this obviously doesn't really resonate with me. I am aware that Crusade exists, and that it may be more my style, but I have also played Crusade before, and it is not what I am looking for. It also still uses the same core rules, which are what I feel like are lacking the most. I quite enjoy competitive play, and honestly just want to play regular Warhammer. I'm a big fan of merging competitive play and narrative play to make really fun and cinematic games that are also strategically challenging. I absolutely love tournaments, and I play competitive MESBG all the time. Crusade is fun, but it just isn't what I'm looking for. I know that Horus Heresy has most of the stuff I miss, but I personally enjoy playing with and against more than just Space Marines. I hope you all enjoyed my video, and if you get the chance, I'd recommend giving old Warhammer a try. Horus Heresy uses a lot of the old rules with some extra fun additions, so if you like Space Marines, you could start there. Me and my friends are going back to play 6th edition, and we're all super excited. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I love you guys. Thanks for watching.